Hello again, everyone, and welcome back for the 200th time to the Best Darn Diddly Review Show. This is a weekly podcast for anyone who loves The Simpsons or ever has loved The Simpsons, hosted by two dudes that grew up on The Simpsons, and today is our 200th episode of the podcast. Now, your co-host with the most, Richie the Whiz Kid, who I'll introduce momentarily, and I often talk about how weird some of the dates and just some of the synchronicity that occurs whenever we're reviewing this show. And today's episode is no different because it just so happens that in the chronological order in which we review this show, this is actually the time at which Phil Hartman, the beloved actor who played Troy McClure, and so many other amazing movie characters, not just his work in The Simpsons, but I'll always remember him from the Monorail song. Regardless, this is actually where he passed away in real life. He passed away on May 28th, 1998, which just so happens to fall between our Season 9 finale, Natural Born Kissers, on May 17th, 1998, and the opening of Season 10, which we'll be back to next week, which was on August 23rd, 1998. So, this is going to be a little bit different episode, but we are going to do a tribute to Phil Hartman today. And joining me, as always, your co-host with the most, Richie the Whiz Kid.
I don't want to weird you out a little bit more, Miles, but did you look at the date that we're recording today? Because it's May 27th, so We're only off by one date.
No, completely missed that. Wow.
Yeah, so that's almost lined up. This is going to sound morbid, but almost perfectly lined up there.
That's weird.
But yeah,
that's
we
did
very,
not
very
like
weird.
this is just where this falls in the schedule. Like, obviously we didn't plan this out or whatever.
Yeah, and you almost said that you needed to wait one more day to record.
I did. So I almost had a conflict today. Whoa.
That would have been kind of crazy there, but like that just came to me while you were talking about dates. I looked at the calendar and went, oh crap. But yeah, goodness. This is happy 200th? Like, no,
I'm not, like, I don't want to be weird here. Yes, I'm so excited and proud of everything that we've done for our 200th episode, and this episode is a celebration, but we're also going to really focus on celebrating the life and career of Phil Hartman, so we'll keep that attitude as we move through this episode.
Alright, well then let's go ahead and get started. Let me throw it back to you. The man, the myth, less the truth, and more the truth. It is Miles.
Man, so I actually have a lot of people that I've reached out to. I have no idea at this point how many of them will have gotten back to me, but throughout this episode you're going to hear from some of our listeners and some of our some fellow comedians, some fellow podcasters, just other people that also were moved by Phil Hartman. But I guess I'll start, Richie, by asking you the same thing I've been telling them to record for me, and essentially talk about what Phil Hartman meant for you, but let's start outside of The Simpsons.
Well, I've said this before on the show, but I will always love Phil Hartman for Jingle All the Way, which
God, yes.
You and I both agree that it's a yearly Christmas watch. You have to, and a lot of people crap on that movie, but I absolutely love it. And one of the reasons I loved it even more watching it in theaters with my father was that I knew who Phil Hartman was, and I was a kid. I think I was in like 5th or 6th grade when that movie came out, but like it totally registered with me that this man in this movie is the guy that does Lionel Hutz and Troy McClure on The Simpsons, and it made me like him even more. And even seeing him in other things, like the Coneheads, it always registered with me who he was. And I remember when my father said that he had been killed, that like it actually. It was a very weird feeling. Like, I mean, not that I hadn't dealt with death in some capacity, but maybe I hadn't.
Maybe not murder, though? Like, there's a difference between death and murder.
Yeah, so, like, when my parents told me that this had happened, it struck a chord with me, because I was like, oh my gosh, like, he's on The Simpsons. Like, what does this mean? Like, it was a very, very strange moment in my life, and it's just all these years later, it's weird to me that I remember so much about that, and it was strange, man, because Phil Hartman he wasn't one of the main characters, but like he was. It's like I knew who Hank Azaria was, and I knew who Phil Hartman was. So it very much was a strange time when I heard the news.
100%. I would agree with that too. And again, outside of The Simpsons, you already said my top pick. I think he is absolutely fantastic in Jingle All the Way. Like he plays such a douchebag character, but he's so charming. Like while he does it, like I kind of want to bake him cookies. But I also there's a one that I think is maybe a little less popular that I always think of, and I actually like unrelated to this. I just watched it recently because I thought about it, but it's actually a movie with him and Sinbad called House Guest. Have you ever seen that?
Yes.
Oh my god, dude, that one is fantastic. He plays I want to say they're dentist, if I remember right, and like basically Sinbad's like a con man pretending to be Phil Hartman's old friend from college and staying at his house. And Hartman is very much the straight man in that, but he does such a good job. And like something that we talk about a lot when we talk about Phil Hartman on SNL, which is the other place that I think that, you know, just Phil Hartman shines so strongly.
Oh, yeah.
But he's able to play those memorable characters, and like even though, you know, he might only have a little bit of screen time, and even if he's not supposed to be the funniest person on the screen, he often is.
Oh man, like even bits that I used to not like as a kid on SNL, like any of the commercials or things like that, when he's in it and he's doing like the narration for it, it made me like those bits so much more. Like he was very good at stealing the spotlight, and I don't necessarily think that was his intention to do it, but he frequently did it. Even in Small Soldiers, man.
I was thinking about that today. Yeah, he was the dad in Small Soldiers, which was actually his final film that he recorded, I believe.
Was that really? Wow.
Yeah. You know, it's funny too, like going back to, like what you were just saying, like not maybe appreciating them when you're younger or whatever, but like I was thinking even like times that he did impressions of people that I didn't know, it was still somehow funny, right? Like even if like you weren't really getting the impression, just like the way he like would put or fall into a character, was just so fun to watch.
I rewatched his Trump scene from SNL last night when I was having trouble sleeping, and like even his Trump, and your I guess younger Trump because it was so long ago, was really really good. Like he was a very good impressionist.
Yeah, so since you brought up Trump, I'll actually bring up the fact that he played Bill Clinton on SNL as well. He started on the show in 1986, which we'll talk more about his career later. We're gonna go into some more stuff here in a bit, but yeah, so his Bill Clinton impression, and since you brought that up, I saw this interview with him that he did in 1995. It was right about a time when he was actually starting up on his show News Radio. But he was being interviewed, and he said something that I feel like maybe everybody or a lot of people may have thought about, but I've never really thought about it too deeply, and it was something that was really on my mind a lot yesterday after I heard it. He basically talked about how a lot of comedians in general, but definitely at that time at SNL and across the board for the most part at SNL, politically lean more liberal, right? So, excuse me, when they are doing these impersonations, whenever they're going after a Republican candidate, they're often like kind of making fun of their policy and like their actions and like their political actions essentially. But whenever they're making fun of a Democratic candidate, they kind of agree with them on a policy standpoint. So what ends up happening is he usually ends up going more like you end up going more like after them as a person. And like in a weird way, it's like this concept of like even though you support this person more, you end up actually taking harder digs at them because you agree with them, which is this fascinating concept that he brought up, and he was referencing actually the idea of if he thought he would get invited to the White House if he'd accept it. And he basically is like, honestly, the things I've said to Bill Clinton, I don't think like I don't see him inviting me to the White House.
Well, that's interesting because if you watch the McDonald's Clinton bit, which is one of his famous ones, it was all about him like eating too much and like not talking to Hillary about the things he's doing and like
very personal stuff.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and even. I really liked his Reagan bit too. His Reagan bit where Reagan was actually like super smart and better than all of his cabinet members was really funny as well. But like definitely the Clinton one, he's taken personal jabs at Clinton a lot. Huh? That's interesting.
So I definitely want to talk more about how much we love Phil, but there are some dark stuff that we're going to have to talk about. So how about real quick we hear from somebody else about Phil, and when we get back, we're going to talk about the documentary that just came out recently, The Last Days of Phil Hartman, and we'll just kind of go through exactly what happened with that whole situation. So we'll be back.
Hey there, best darn diddly. This is Patsy the Angry Nerd.
And Ashes Von Nightmare.
From Throwdown Thursday, and we just want to congratulate you guys on 200 episodes, which is a huge accomplishment. 200 episodes, never missing a week, never taking a day off, even though you are Mr. Most Days Off. I guess Richie the Whiz Kid's holding you accountable so you don't take as many days off as you maybe should, because you guys have put out an episode every week for the past 200 weeks. That's like...
That's a lot of weeks. That's a lot of math right there that we can't do right now because we drank a lot of wine.
I'm math good. But yeah, that's a lot of weeks in a row to do anything. Like, even being alive for 200 weeks in a row is an accomplishment, so...
Congratulations on being alive.
Yeah, and doing a podcast for 200 weeks. Like, this is pretty great. You guys are awesome.
We love your show.
Oh, yes, and I definitely think that your show could be so much better if there was more Patsy the Angry Nerd on it, which I think I proved on Homer the Great, because that was a pretty great episode. And Ashes, you did some stuff too.
I did. I was on a episode from some season talking about Marge doing stuff.
Yeah, Marge doing stuff. That narrows it down for you hardcore Simpsons fan. Of course, there'll be somebody out there like, ooh, worst episode ever. But you guys are talking a little bit about Phil Hartman today, and we just wanted to tell you about some of our favorite non-Simpsons favorite Phil Hartman moments.
Which is difficult because a lot of our favorite Phil Hartman moments revolve around The Simpsons.
That's true.
And Troy McClure.
Yeah, Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz. He's definitely the best lawyer that the show has ever had. And a fun fact, I'm sure you guys will mention it, but Philip J. Fry from Futurama is actually named after Phil Hartman because Phil was supposed to play Zap Brannigan and bring his signature sarcastic wit and his dry delivery to that character. And one of my favorite things he ever did was there was like this round table discussion show on Saturday Night Live where Phil Hartman was there with Kevin Nealon, and Kevin Nealon was Tarzan, and John Lovitz, who is a Simpsons alum, as Artie Ziff, and Llewellyn Sinclair, as well as Llewellyn Sinclair's sister. He played Tonto from The Lone Ranger, and then Phil Hartman played Frankenstein's monster, and they were going around the table, and they were asking everybody what they thought about fire, and Tarzan was like, "Ooh, fire good, fire good," and then you had Tonto saying, "Well, fire good," and then you had Phil Hartman playing Frankenstein's monster, like I said. He's like, "Fire bad," just like that was a thing he did. He played Frankenstein's monster on several different skits, and it was always funny. And he always said the same shit. Like, it was always, "Fire bad." It was so great. I loved it because he was just so good. Of course, who can forget his Bill Clinton impressions?
Oh, iconic.
Yeah, and his
the unfrozen caveman lawyer.
I may be just an unfrozen caveman lawyer, but yeah, that's what we really grew up with. I mean, this is a man who had, a stunningly long career from 1980 through his untimely death, unfortunately, in 1999, I want to say. Yeah, he did a lot of stuff, a lot of voice acting on like Animaniacs and shows like that. Eek the Cat, which is a show I watched all the time.
He was even a part of Pee-wee.
That's true.
Pee-wee's Playhouse.
Yep. In the TV movie that it did in whenever that was. I don't remember what year it was.
We'll say the late 1900s.
The late 1900s, yes. Yeah, in case you don't feel old enough, kids are referring to the 80s and 90s as the late 1900s. So stick that in your straw and suck it. But yeah, we just want to say, again, congratulations
on episode 200.
Huge milestone. You guys are awesome. You guys are welcome on our show anytime. We haven't had you on in a while, so I think that's something we got to make amends for. So we're going to have to get you guys on again, especially with a new season of F is for Family.
This is true.
So thanks, guys. We love you. Congratulations once again. And keep on being cromulent. Take care, guys.
Bye.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on Best Darn Diddly. This is Justin, longtime listener, and you may remember me as the voice of Reverend Lovejoy from 22 short films about Springfield. I want to talk just a little bit about Phil Hartman, who you guys are doing an episode on. The best guest voice that has ever been on The Simpsons by far. One of my favorite characters, Lionel Hutz, but Lyle Lanley and Troy McClure. Just a great. Love that episode with the Planet of the Apes. Love whenever he got to singing. But one thing I know you guys don't get in too much on your show, but he was just so good on other things, like when he was on The Critic as Adolf Hitmaker. And Jay Sherman says, "Wow, I hope you do well." He goes, "No, I won't. You see, I used to be Vanilla Ice." Like those sort of things that he used to say that just kind of blow you away and catch you off guard. He is by far the most prolific actor of his time. He had 90 credits on IMDb before he passed away. And just, if you look at it and see how many people the names of all the people that he played on Saturday Night Live, it's astounding. And Chris Farley used to say that Phil Hartman was the glue. And he was the glue that would keep everything together and the reason that they could shine the way that they did. Because if you look at all the people that he was supporting, you're talking about the biggest acts in comedy ever. You've got Adam Sandler, David Spade, and Rob Schneider, Chris Rock, Chris Farley. All these guys, they made it because of Phil Hartman supporting them on there. And they'll even admit that to themselves. But keep doing what you do. Best Darn Diddly. Love the show. And thanks for having me on, guys. Bye.
One of the things that I found most fun, just from putting this project together, is so many people, when I'd reach out about talking about Phil Hartman, they just lit up with yes, of course, I would love to talk about how much Phil means to me. Because, if you're of a certain age, or even, I think a pretty large age range, Phil Hartman influenced if you're a comedian or have any comedic pursuits, or even if you're conversationally funny, Phil Hartman influenced you.
Just anybody with a sense of humor, yeah. So you don't even have to be a comedian, and you can't really say that he didn't influence you, especially that cult following of Jingle All the Way, Miles.
So I just said, we were going to talk a little bit about the last days of Phil Hartman and go into that situation real quick. But that documentary in general is pretty good. I enjoyed watching it. I felt like I learned a lot, and it's one of those where it's nice to hear the people that love Phil talk about Phil, and if you do watch it, you'll see people from The Simpsons like Al Jean and Mike Scully was also on the show.
Yeah, I wrote exclamation marks by both of their names because I realized watching and listening to Al that I don't know if I'd ever seen or heard from Al before, in any kind of sense. So it took me. I was taken aback. I was like, "Oh, this is Al Jean, cool." And then when Mike Scully got on there with his big suit on and everything, I was like, "Hey, Mike, hey!"
Our old friend Mike.
Yeah, and it's hearing his voice, and I was like, "That sounds just like you because it is actually you." It's
you sound familiar. Yeah, totally. But you'll see those familiar faces as well as a lot of the people that were on SNL. And at the Groundlings, because remember, Phil actually started at the Groundlings before. That's kind of where he got his big break. But Something, we talked about how I said he influences and inspires people. Like, honestly, Phil even, like, inspired me just watching that documentary, because something that you may not have realized is, like, when Phil got on SNL in 1986, he was in his late 30s.
Yeah, he was 38.
He was not the traditional, young comedian that they're trying to get like, he was much older than the rest of the cast.
Well, didn't they even bring?
What I'm trying to say.
It strikes true chords with both of us right now. But didn't they also say he got invited to join the Groundlings after he got pulled up from the audience and just did such a good job that they invited him to join them as well?
Yeah, so this was interesting because I did not know this either, but Phil Hartman was actually a very talented artist, and he was actually working. He was like basically a roadie essentially. And he was drawing album art for, like, bands in California, like, total hippy-dippy lifestyle, which is pretty cool. He's a kid from Canada who just kind of, like, made his way around. Right? But he, watching him in this documentary, he reflected on the fact that this actually was turning him into quite the introvert, and he found that was, like, kind of depressing him a bit. So he heard about the Groundlings improv show, and he actually went. And they, like you said, they asked for an audience member to participate. He volunteered, and it's amazing to actually see the other improv performers talk about, like, the ones that shared the stage with him, because they all agree, like, he was like a bolt of lightning hit the stage. Like, his energy just was, like, through the roof. And, like, I've been to plenty of audience participation improv shows, and the one thing they have in common is they're usually funny only because, like, the person on stage is so nervous that, like, the other comedic actors can work with that or whatever, but, like, no one usually goes up there and, like, really stills the show like that. But it sounds like just Phil is like a natural. He hit the stage and just immediately knew what to do and to have fun and to be supportive, and he turned that into this ability to create these great characters, and that's really what he became known for on SNL, and really in his movie career as well. He kind of, would build on those characters he created through improv.
Yeah, and some of his friends spoke in the documentary as well about how, like, fast he was at creating these roles, and that, like, he was just such a creative mind. He had such a creative mind that he could just come up with things left and right, and that it made it so much more of a natural talent, basically. But honestly, man, his start just in life in general and everything just reminded me of you a little bit when they were talking about him, when his friends were talking about him. And I was like, oh, yeah, that sounds kind of like Miles. I mean, maybe Miles doesn't surf as much, but I could see Miles doing all this.
Man, that is, honest to God, the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me. Like, I don't know how I'm going to finish the rest of this podcast with all these tears in my eyes.
Well, especially since it, like, leaned into the stand-up stuff a little bit, too. So I'm like, oh, man, that means you're only, like, 3 years off from landing SNL, man.
Yep, I could make a dark joke there, but I'm not, so therefore we are going to move on forward. But unfortunately, as everybody does know, this story does eventually get dark. They mentioned in the documentary, too, that Phil is very quick in terms of falling in love, and he actually was married 3 times total. So he was married twice before he met Bryn, which, let me see here. I want to make sure I get this right. Bryn Hartman. I don't have her maiden name.
Her maiden name was very, very tough.
So Bryn Hartman was his 3rd wife, and she was an aspiring actress herself. And according to this Last Days of Phil Hartman documentary, that's actually what really started to cause a lot of the friction in their relationship that eventually led to the death of Phil Hartman. One thing that I thought was really, really interesting, very, unsettling in a lot of ways, honestly, but just, like, maybe the most interesting point in the documentary that I found was during the opening credits of Saturday Night Live in the very early 90s, Phil, like, they would do the thing, they still do it, basically they're, like, capturing candid moments in New York City is the idea. And Phil Hartman was actually sitting across from a diner from a beautiful blonde woman at, like, a New York cafe or whatever, and he's supposed to be looking into the camera. Well, the woman across from him is actually his wife, Bryn, and apparently she kept trying to get her face on camera, and the director had to be like, no, you need to look at Phil. And, she was essentially trying to, like, get herself out there a little bit. And if you watch the opening credits of Saturday Night Live when Phil's in that diner scene, the woman across from him, her earring is dangling wildly. And that is because she had literally just turned her head back around from facing the camera. And her so right recently that, like, her earring was still swaying.
And that's really weird, too, because I remember when they would introduce Phil, like, I've seen that shot so many times before, so it's kind of weird and creepy in a way.
Yeah, it's one of those things you've seen hundreds of times, more than likely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But, yeah, it sounds like he had some issues in the loving sense, because they said frequently that he would be head over heels for somebody, and then it would he'd almost separate himself from them. And, like, even his second marriage, because they interview the wife in the documentary a lot. She said, like, weeks after they were married, it was almost like it had changed. Everything that he had promised had changed. And, it's a little bit on both sides, I'm sure. But, yeah, he seemed to have some issues, which, like, it seems like the comedy routines definitely were his release. They gave him satisfaction, too. So...
Yeah, and also it sounds like that there was some animosity in the sense that it seemed like when Phil was working, he was away from the family, but he was also, to your point, pulling away from the family because he was quite the hobbyist, and he owned boats and an airplane, and he would frequently, be found out on his boat or out flying, essentially away from everyone, including his family, and I do believe that was part of the reason that, started this, part of the fuel in the fire of the hostile relationship that Phil and Bryn had.
Yeah, and he had 2 kids with her, and, like, I enjoyed seeing the home videos with him and his kids, because, like, it definitely seemed like when he was there, he was a good father, but I could see where, like, if that persists where you're away from them a lot, that can get very frustrating, I'm sure. I'm not a parent, but, like, I can't imagine not being around your kids more and more, and I'm definitely somebody that has the work mentality when, like, work is calling, so, like, I see it a little bit from both sides there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated issue. Anytime there's a relationship like that, it's going to be complicated, but definitely what it escalated to was absolutely horrific.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I didn't remember that, like, everything leading up to the finality of that night. Like, I didn't remember that she was out at a bar and got super drunk and all that stuff, apparently. So, there was a lot of emotions probably going on around in her head that night.
It seemed like evidence suggested that she both suffered from drug and alcohol abuse to some extent. They did, when Phil Hartman was tragically murdered, he was murdered by Bryn while their 6-year-old daughter and 9-year-old son were in the home. And to make matters worse, Bryn actually turned the gun on herself after murdering her husband. So it was a murder-suicide. And there's actually, I mean, it's very sad to watch, but the news reports and things of that nature are available on YouTube. And the children were actually found on the front porch when the police arrived. And at that time, they heard a gunshot, which was Bryn killing herself. But Phil had at that point already been dead for some time, according to the police. Yeah,
I thought it said like several hours later. Like, so I think she killed him like 2 hours before she killed herself, if I remember correctly. And that's, oh man,
that was at that all happened in Encino, California, where they lived in a really beautiful home. But
oh yeah, the house was amazing. Like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, for sure. Update on the kids, because obviously that was very, very sad. The kids, Sean and Bergen, they, first of all, I thought this was very, very interesting. They actually went to live with Bryn's sister, their maternal aunts, which there was a little bit of family friction, I guess you could say, with what Bryn had done. Wanting like that side of the family taking them in essentially, but there is some mediation done by Phil's family as well. They kind of like essentially discussed everything, and honestly, like with this level of emotion, I can't even imagine. But they essentially were able to come to terms that Bryn's actions didn't reflect on her family's love for the children, and they also lived in Wisconsin, where they felt that they could give them a very good chance of kind of getting under the radar and not being Phil Hartman's kids, and just getting to be kids. 2020 update. Bergen was actually married in 2018, and in 2016, I want to say, she actually had posted a post about being drug-free for 5 years, in 2017. So basically, it seems like she may have struggled with some drug abuse herself, but she has since got sober, clean, and married, and she is happy. She appeared actually at the tribute show on SNL for Phil Hartman, and said a few words, but she, for the most part, wants to stay out of the spotlight. Her brother, Sean, even more so, though he is actually an artist and musician, he doesn't even have a social media account, so he very much prefers his anonymity.
He has a degree, too, if I remember correctly, so, like, he's maybe got a little bit of the father talent there, just using it in a little bit of a different way, but that's cool.
Yeah. Actually, their fund, their inheritance, was actually set up so that they would start receiving it after they graduated college.
Oh, well, that will be helpful.
Well, kind of interesting, just that he had things set up that way. But that brings us to the end of the dark part of what happened. I think what we'll do is take another quick break and hear from somebody else real quick, and then we'll come back and talk about some more fun stuff that Phil did.
Hi, I'm Corey Whaley, and my favorite cast of Saturday Night Live is the one from the late 80s, which was Dana Carvey, Nora Dunn, Phil Hartman, Jan Hooks, Victoria Jackson, John Lovitz, Dennis Miller, and Kevin Nealon. So that was my cast. And Phil Hartman was one of the last performers from that group to leave the show. Kevin Nealon stayed one season longer. So in the years he was on the show, 86 to 94, Phil Hartman was my favorite. Part of that was because in the local plays and musicals I'd been in growing up, I tended to get more character roles, which was kind of how I saw Phil Hartman fitting into that cast. He had a wide range of characters, was always funny, and played things in a very grounded way, which is, part of what made him so great. And because I identified with him so much, when he was killed by his wife in 1998, it was like a friend of mine had died. His death is one of the few celebrity deaths that really affected me. I think he's one of our most underrated comedians, and I wish he'd gotten more recognition. Aside from all the characters he voiced on The Simpsons and maybe being on the show News Radio, he's not really known for much else outside of SNL. But to this day, he's still my all-time favorite SNL cast member and one of my favorite comedians in general.
I'm Jamie Zeski, huge Simpsons fan, huge Phil Hartman fan. I grew up with Phil Hartman and remembered enjoying his work in Pee-wee's Playhouse and Saturday Night Live, and one of my personal favorites, News Radio. I really felt like I grew up with him over the course of those couple of shows. He was a master at versatility. He was a master at doing a lot with a little, and I wish that he had lived long enough that I could say I remember him from such films as the Troy McClure motion picture.
What's up, guys? My name's Chris Manley. I know when I was asked to do this, the very first thing I did was I went back and I watched Small Soldiers, which is the first film I saw Phil Hartman in when I was a kid, one of my absolute favourites. I never actually made the connection between that film and obviously the actor Phil Hartman and The Simpsons until years later. Obviously in The Simpsons he plays a vast array of characters, including Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz. One of my favourite episodes of his has to be A Fish Called Selma, where Troy marries Aunt Selma and then of course takes part in the amazing Planet of the Apes musical, which is just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. One of the greatest pieces of comedy that I've ever seen. Another great film I saw him in was Jingle All the Way alongside Arnold Schwarzenegger. another one of my favorite Christmas films as a kid. I think it's really, really unfortunate, really sad that Phil's no longer around anymore, because I feel like if he was, he'd still be absolutely knocking it out of the park comedy-wise. It's really sad. But it's great that we get to continue to watch all of his work and continue his legacy that way. So I just want to say rest in peace, Phil Hartman. You're greatly missed. And we appreciate everything you did for comedy and for The Simpsons. And also, I want to thank Miles and Richie the Whiz Kid for giving me this opportunity to speak about them. Rest in peace, Phil. We miss you.
Hi, I'm Teach That Ash, and you might remember me from such things as Twitter. What can you say about Phil Hartman that someone else hasn't already said? He's a legend and the voice behind one of my favorite TV characters ever, Troy McClure. Every single time Troy McClure is on screen, you could expect hilarity. When people think of the classic era of The Simpsons, it's what I think of. The moments where our favorite yellow family would be gathered around the television screen, watching some poorly made documentary starring the man himself, Troy McClure. It's so incredibly rare that every single line that a character delivers in a television show is hilarious. But that's the case here. Every single line is genius. The shoddily made educational movies that he starred in that were as counterproductive as they were hilarious are works of art. Troy McClure, despite not being a Simpsons regular, was a highlight of every episode he was featured in. In fact, you could say that The Simpsons started to change in the aftermath of Phil Hartman's death. You see, all TV shows start to lose something the longer they run and the more their audience starts to catch on to the rhythms of what they do. And there's no way in 30-plus seasons that The Simpsons could always surprise anybody. And there are other ways you can judge just how a show has shifted over 3 decades on the air. When it began, it was Bart's show. The 10-year-old was the center of most stories, and he was a series breakout character. He got many of the best jokes, and most of the show's relationships ran through him. But as The Simpsons evolved, so did the Simpson family and the Springfield residents, and led to some of the best episodes in TV history. The Simpsons is a tribute to TV's elasticity, to the idea that all you need for a great TV show is some good characters, a great world, and a premise that can stretch in any direction. Congratulations on 200 episodes of Best Darn Diddly Boys. You deserve all the good things, and I'm so thankful to consider you friends.
Richie, as we said earlier, there is so much to love about Phil Hartman, and actually doing research for this podcast, I came across a lot of, I don't by any means think it's rare, I just think it might be overlooked, and like when you're going through Phil Hartman, YouTube essentially. But one of the things I found, I actually mentioned it earlier when I talked about his take on politics, but on April 10th, 1995, Phil Hartman actually had an appearance on the Late Late Show with Tom Schneider, who I'm not familiar with. But it was a really great interview, honestly, and they talked a lot about Phil's career up to that point. Phil did some demonstrations on how he does his voice acting, which is really, really interesting. He talks about how he feels like it just all comes down to, like, whose, like, tone your vocal cords are in, and like, but he was able to shift from like John Wayne up to Jack Nicholson without really changing his voice, just kind of like changing where it was coming from. But I say all that to say that he actually was offered his own sketch comedy show, the Phil Hartman Show, right before he decided to take news radio instead, and it was just a really fascinating take because he was so good at sketch comedy. I mean, that was really his forte starting out. But he basically saw the downfall of, variety television in primetime, and said that he could even see that as the network execs would lose faith in that, the money-making potential of his show, it was like becoming a more and more difficult road to have the creative control that he would want. And that was before he even signed a contract.
Well, I thought it was interesting that they did in that interview that you're speaking of the John Wayne thing, because if you remember in the Last Days of Phil Hartman, his friend talks about how he did like a 1 hour John Wayne impersonation when they were up in the waters, and then there was fog everywhere, and they said there was 100 people in the fog and they couldn't see each other, and he just started doing a John Wayne impersonation, and everyone was just like basically glued to him from what they could tell. Like that's pretty cool.
It is cool, and it's fun to watch his process too.
It's something else one of his friends said, like in his earlier life, where they compared him to Forrest Gump, and I thought that was very interesting, just because like before he got into his role in life, he got to do a whole lot of random crap, and it isn't actual crap, but like they very much compared it to the way Forrest Gump got to do a little bit of everything, and that
was a great analogy, honestly.
Yeah,
like, that really paints a great picture.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Were there any other? I know we already talked about shows and movies he's in. Obviously, I guess we should probably talk a little bit about his, tributes to The Simpsons. That old thing.
Yeah. So, I was gonna bring up that like I saw that he was on 2 episodes of Ren and Stimpy, and I thought, man, I wonder if I caught that as a kid. I'm sure I had to have catch that as a kid. Ren and Stimpy's so far out of my brain that I just don't remember if I actually caught his voice on the show, but like going through his list on IMDb, he was just in so many things, and like I think it says he was in 91 different things just as an actor or voice actor, and considering the small amount of time we had with Phil Hartman, like that's incredible. There's people that have been working forever that don't have that many credits on there, so.
Dude, I was just scrolling through. I just noticed he did an episode of the Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure TV series, the live action version, I believe. Oh no, I'm sorry. This one is the animated version. I apologize, but like he's in everything. He's in absolutely DuckTales. You mentioned Ren and Stimpy. Pee-wee's Playhouse, dude. Like we didn't talk about that. Like that all came from like a character, like the captain character he does. Came from when he was on or in the Groundlings with Paul Rubin.
Yep,
aka Pee Wee Herman.
It's interesting to I never realized before watching the documentary that it was even on Pee Wee's Big Adventure. So, I just said Big Adventure. That's the movie.
We know.
I don't remember.
Pee Wee's Playhouse is the show.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, he was on Darkwing Duck too. I didn't even catch that one earlier. So yeah, it's literally like all this stuff I used to watch as a kid. He was involved with in some capacity, and that's just incredible to think about all these years later.
I mean, his most famous characters are Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, but he did a bunch of other stuff. I mean, like, we already talked, or I mentioned it earlier, the monorail, Lyle Landley. Yeah, like, that character, just like the brief time we had with Lyle Landley, was so impactful, but like as you're watching The Simpsons, you hear Phil's voice come through so many times,
and it's so noticeable. It's impossible not to recognize his voice. But I want to ask you this, Miles. I'm going to ask you a question that I don't think I can actually answer myself. Let's flash forward to 2020. You can have one character back in Phil Hartman's voice. Is it Troy McClure or Lionel Hutz?
Oh, like when you first, I was like, oh, I think that's easy. Wait,
yeah. I lean towards Lionel Hutz, but it's like Troy
McClure, but like,
Troy McClure's lines, like his catchphrase, is just like I love it every time he does it, and I can't wait to hear the 2 titles he's going to bring up. You might remember me from such films as like I just don't know. Lionel Hutz has so many great moments though, but like he's kind of I don't like him a lot of the times, but that's the point.
Yeah, exactly. He's not supposed to be your friend. But no, that might be a very impossible question. Let's hear your thoughts if you're listening and want to chime in on Twitter at BestDarnDiddly. Which character? I'm sure I can make one of those poll things. I'll try to do that when this comes out.
Lionel Hutz or Troy McClure? Lyle Landley's the obvious choice. That's why I didn't throw him in there.
No, it's got to be one of his like main
current
characters.
Yeah,
his reoccurring roles. Like that's a really tough call. But yeah. But there is still a little bit more Phil in The Simpsons, actually, because...
Did you notice how Miles sidestepped the question and didn't answer it?
Oh, I didn't. I did not answer. No, I'm taking a stance to abstain. I like almost immediately was like, clearly Troy wait, well, oh shit, but like I mean, like I'm just drawn right now to the like Lionel Hutz scene where he has to change the grammar and the business card, the flyer or whatever. It's like, no, you misread the ad.
In fact, I'm not even wearing a tie. That's a different one.
But yeah, there will still be more Phil Hartman, at least one more, I believe. I'm after looking into it with lots of misinformation from the own commentary of The Simpsons themselves. It does seem like Bart the Mother, which is the 3rd episode of season 10. So 3 episodes from now will be the last appearance of Phil Hartman on The Simpsons.
And I definitely remember The Simpsons without Phil Hartman as a younger viewer, and you miss the characters. It's hard not to. There's so many times where you feel like bringing Lionel Hudson or Troy McClure would just be so much fun in different moments, and they're just gone. And it's just weird to think about it, and you just assume they went on to... Lionel Hutz probably died in a dumpster somewhere, and Troy McClure probably died in a fish tank somewhere. Like, I don't know how else to describe what happened to them.
I mean, that would make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and yeah, you're right. It's somebody that you just can't replace. I mean, and honestly, I feel very similar to Phil Hartman as I do to Chris Farley, who's one who I consider to be the greatest comedian of all time. But Chris Farley and Phil Hartman actually appeared on a talk show together, and we've talked about before. Phil Hartman was referred to as the glue on SNL because he held the staff, or he held the staff together, basically. He held the actors and everybody together. And again, we mentioned he was older, but it's just his stability and his ability. What's interesting, too, there is Phil Hartman himself even says at one point, like, he never thought he would be more than just a utility player because he was versatile. He never really thought he would go on to be given, bigger roles and things of that nature. But there's a really sweet interview or talk show interview, and again, it's Phil Hartman and Chris Farley together, and Chris Farley is the one that publicly says, like, Phil is the glue man, like, he's the one that keeps us all together. It's heartbreaking. It's like just like so touching to see those two together.
And their deaths weren't too far apart from each other either, so that's just like that's crazy to think about. But on the SNL scene, they also reference in a few of the interviews that, like, when the younger cast started coming on SNL, like Farley and Adam Sandler and Rob Schneider and David Spade, that Phil Hartman didn't necessarily enjoy it at first because he had to keep being the not funny guy. He had to be like the straight guy in all the scenes. But then he did the Clinton impersonation, and all of a sudden he was like the star again. And I thought that was interesting because there's a lot, we talked about it with Mike Scully, where Steve Martin was famous for being the straight man that just had to react to things Homer was doing. And so, like, Phil Hartman had to do that for quite a while on SNL and, like, to still be as funny as he was. And he may not enjoy being the straight guy at times, but, like, he does such a good job of that, like, the tones he would take and the sarcasm he would have, even at just being the straight guy, is just so funny that, like, you're doing great, Phil. Don't worry about it. Your time will come as Clinton.
Yeah, totally. And I think that, like, even though, again, significantly older than that bunch coming through, like, his energy was through the roof. I mean, like, he was like lightning in a bottle, man.
Well, and they didn't dive too much into the SNL history, but they said the first year that Hartman was on in '86, that the year before they had come off a season where people just didn't think the show was funny anymore. And then, of course, Phil Hartman joins a good cast, and all of a sudden they think it's another golden age of SNL. So
he made it must-watch TV again.
Yeah. So he was. I mean, it's almost like he was always on. I was going to say when he's on, he was great, but like he was always on. So
at least when we saw him, yeah, for sure.
Yep.
But yeah, what a comedian! What an influence on so many people, and like. Even, we've had conversations, we talked about Phil Hartman with Carolyn Omine, and, like, she didn't actually cross over at the Groundlings with Phil, but, like, his legacy and his legend was just so big, even, when she was there a few years after him, that it's, this magical... I think everybody that goes through the Groundlings and everybody that goes through SNL, like, every single one of them probably have a moment where they're like, oh my god, Phil Hartman was here.
Yeah, that's big shoes to fill, even though that's not a character he voices.
Right. But yeah, I think that is going to do it for our 200th podcast Phil Hartman celebration here today. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this podcast each and every week. It means so much when we see your feedback, even if it's for you roasting me for being lazy at editing now. Which I feel like this episode is going to, at least give me a little bit of slack on that, because, man. But yeah, anyway, 200 episodes in the can, dude, and we are about to kick off with Season 10 next week.
Thank you so much, everybody, for listening to our show. I mean, this is 200 episodes. I honestly used to do the math on where we would be at if we kept our show the way that we started, and I think going, 4 years in, we're almost at our 4-year anniversary, I think. We were supposed to be basically halfway done with the show, but since we switched to single episodes, we're really far off. We're almost, after the next season is done, we'll almost be a third of the way through, but not quite there yet. So we are planning on being here for a while, so I hope you guys stay tuned and keep listening to us each and every week, because it's fun. It's something we get to talk about that made a big impact on us from a young age, and obviously still impacts us now. And, the man we've been talking about this whole episode was a huge part of that impact. So it's going to be interesting to see how that changes going forward.
100%, man. And I hope that you all do come back again with us next week as we do keep going forward. As I mentioned, we will be reviewing Season 10, Episode 1, Lord of the Dance.
And you may remember us from such podcasts as 200 before the next one.
I was literally going to do a similar joke. Fuck it, I will anyway. And until next time, hi, I'm Mr. Most Days Off. And you might remember me from doing this 199 times in the past. But as always, be cromulent to each other.